For this project, I wanted to show an app that is unbelievably helpful for my digital photography students. This is the canonoutsideofauto.ca, which has multiple instances where you can really utilize technology to help your students. You have a chance to learn, you have a chance to play, and you have a chance to challenge yourself. And I have found it to be really helpful regardless of the level of knowledge that my students have. I have so many students that range in knowledge in photography, from those who have taken other classes in our school or those who have never touched a digital camera. They only take pictures on their phones. So as I started looking for the ISTE standards, one of the ones that I looked at for students was using the digital tools to construct knowledge. And that's where the learning aspect, I think, really comes in here. I am really impressed with this site for what they can do, and it's a free site, and is that it just shows the different areas that, okay, if you're going for, you want a little bit of exposure, or you want to know a little bit about exposure, here's your information. This is what we want to do with the aperture, that it's controlling the amount of blur or sharpness around your subject. And then it has pretty in-depth information below that. And so then you can see the difference in the sites where you have f-stop of 2.8 versus the aperture of f22. And so another standard that I thought would work really well for me as the teacher was that this facilitates learning with technology, and it's supporting their achievement, the students' achievement, because this is something that I utilize in class, where even though I am lecturing them in a setting with an actual presentation, then we take this time each class period as we go through learning about aperture, as we go through learning about shutter speed, and then ISO. And these are the three technical areas of photography that are so important for these students to understand. You know, you could use auto everything on your digital camera and it would fix it for you, but I want them to understand the nitty-gritty of it. I want them to understand why their photo looks this way so that they can fix it themselves. So here we have the play aspect of it, and this is the part that I focus on the most. I find that the challenge is especially good for my stronger photo students, the ones who have taken other classes, their knowledge is just greater, but the play is really helpful for anybody. And so we can just leave it right here where the aperture is 8, your shutter speed is 1/60th of a second, and your ISO is at 1600. We take that picture, and then what it tells you is hey, your exposure is good. Because of your aperture setting, your shallow depth of field, it gives you a short or a narrow depth of field. So the subject is sharper than the background. So the background is more blurred, out of focus, as opposed to the front. And then you have the invisible motion, which shows us about the shutter speed. You know, our shutter speed isn't high enough to capture that. And so, okay, if I want them being able to blur the foreground, then let's drop this down here. We'll leave everything the same and see what happens. Wow, it's totally overexposed, and we can find that that is because the ISO is really high. It's at 1600, and with my aperture being low, it allows more light in, so it's overexposed. It does give us a lot of blur in the front though, so let's throw that one away and let's try a different one. Let's leave our aperture here, but let's lower the ISO. Let's lower it down to 100 and see what happens with it. And then we see, okay, this is better. We're not getting as much light in, we're getting the amount of light that we need. And because my apertures, my f-stops are so low, the only thing in focus here is the airplane. But let's say then we want to go into figuring out how can we get everything in focus. All right, let's leave everything the same and we'll move this up to f-stop of 16. Let's take that picture. Wow, that is really, really dark. And that has to do with the fact that because my f-stops are so high, uh, that it's not letting enough light in. So let's get rid of that. Let's adjust the ISO. Let's try 1600. And you see that it looks really pretty good. It's still a little bit dark, but everything is in focus, which is exactly what you want out of this. Now, we want to try this when it comes to shutter speed. Shutter speed captures motions at about 1/250th of a second. So let's just start here. Let's leave the aperture where it was, leave the ISO where it was, and see what happens. And it's just way too dark because of the fact that, as I tell them, the shutter speed doesn't let enough light in. So then they can go back and play with it a little bit. Let's see if we drop our aperture all the way down. Let's maybe even increase our ISO because, wow, it was dark. And, well, we overcorrected both the ISO and we overcorrected for the aperture. So let's try something different. Let's lower this ISO down to about 200, leave the aperture, leave the shutter speed still being able to capture motion. Looks a lot better. Still dark, but now we can start to see that propeller. So this is where technology really does help my photography kids. It's primarily for them as opposed to their parents, although I do find that I have some students who will tell their parents about that. But really what this does is it really helps them before they go out and take photos, before they start working technically on their photos. And that to me is probably the most important part, is that you've got the hands-on training and this just gives you an explanation. So if I'm not next to them as they're taking those photos and their pictures aren't turning out just right and maybe they forgot an adjustment, something like this can really help guide them.